The halls of Riverside Middle School buzzed with the usual morning energy as students rushed to their first classes of the day. Among them was 12-year-old Michael, a bright-eyed seventh grader known for his quick wit and friendly smile. He clutched his carefully completed history assignment in his hands. The one he'd spent extra hours on the night before, making sure every detail was perfect. The assignment had been challenging. Write a detailed analysis of the civil rights movement and its impact on modern American society. Michael had thrown himself into the research, staying up late to include lesser-known facts and thoughtful insights. His mom had even caught him reading under the covers with a flashlight, long after his bedtime. That's just who Michael was, a kid who loved learning and always gave his best. Ms. Thompson's history class was usually his favorite. He loved connecting the dots between past and present, understanding how yesterday's events shaped today's world. But lately, something had changed. He'd noticed how Miss Thompson would barely acknowledge his raised hand, how she'd cut him off mid-sentence, or give him lower grades than classmates who gave similar answers. Still, Michael remained hopeful. This time, he was sure his hard work would pay off. He'd even asked his older sister, a high school junior, to review his essay before he wrote the final draft. She'd been impressed, ruffling his hair and saying, "Little bro, you might be smarter than me already." As he settled into his usual seat near the window, Michael watched Ms. Thompson collect the assignments row by row. The morning sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, catching dust particles in its golden beams. The familiar scent of chalk and old textbooks filled the air as students chatted quietly, sharing their weekend stories. "Remember to write your names clearly," Ms. Thompson announced, her voice carrying that same edge it always seemed to have lately. "I want grade papers if I can't read who they're from." Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she moved between the desks, gathering papers with perfectly manicured hands. When she reached Michael's desk, he handed over his assignment with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He'd made sure his name was printed neatly in the top right corner, just as she'd instructed. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Michael thought he saw something flicker across Ms. Thompson's face, something that made his stomach twist uncomfortably. The rest of the week crawled by slowly. Michael kept glancing at the stack of graded papers on Ms. Thompson's desk, wondering when they'd get their assignments back. He noticed how she returned other students' work throughout the week, a few papers here, a few there, but his remained mysteriously absent. Finally, on Friday afternoon, just as the final bell was about to ring, Ms. Thompson called him to her desk. The classroom was almost empty, with just a few students lingering to pack up their bags. Michael approached her desk, his heart beating a little faster than usual. "Here's your paper," she said, sliding it across her desk without looking at him. The red marks jumped out immediately, but it wasn't just the C grade that made Michael's heart sink. Scrawled across the top of his paper, in the same red ink, was a comment that made his hands shake as he read it. The words were cruel, questioning not just his intelligence, but his very background and capability to succeed. Michael stood there, frozen, as the final bell rang and the last few students filed out. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the comment again, unable to believe what he was seeing. He carefully folded the paper and slipped it into his backpack, his movements mechanical, his mind racing. The proudly researched facts and carefully crafted sentences now felt tainted, marked by something ugly and mean. As he walked out of the classroom, he could feel Ms. Thompson's eyes on his back, but he didn't turn around. The hallway seemed longer than usual as he made his way to his locker. A few friends called out to him, but their voices sounded distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. He packed his bags slowly, trying to decide what to do. Should he show someone? Tell the principal? Keep it to himself? What would his parents say? His older sister was waiting by the school entrance, as she did every Friday. One look at his face, and she knew something was wrong. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Michael just shook his head, not trusting himself to speak just yet. As they walked home together, Michael's mind was already racing ahead to what would happen next. What he didn't know, what Ms. Thompson certainly didn't know, was that this incident would set off a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire school system. Because while Ms. Thompson saw just another student she could bully, she had no idea who Michael's father was, or what was about to unfold. That evening, Michael sat at his desk, staring at the folded paper he couldn't bring himself to show his parents. The bedroom walls, covered with honor roll certificates from previous years, seemed to mock him now. His sister had tried to get him to talk during their walk home, but he just shrugged and said he was tired. How could he explain something that made so little sense even to himself? Dinner that night was harder than usual. His mom had made his favorite lasagna, and everyone was sharing stories about their day. His little brother was excitedly talking about scoring a goal in PE class, while his dad discussed a big case he was working on. Michael just pushed his food around his plate, trying to smile at the right moments. "You're quiet tonight," his mom said, reaching over to feel his forehead. "Are you feeling okay?" The concern in her voice almost broke him. He nodded quickly, stuffing a big bite of lasagna in his mouth so he wouldn't have to answer more questions. After dinner, he retreated to his room, supposedly to do homework. Instead, he finally unfolded the paper, smoothing out the creases. The red ink seemed even brighter under his desk lamp. The comment at the top of the page went beyond just marking his work. It was personal, cruel, suggesting that certain students would never succeed, no matter how hard they tried. His hands started shaking again as he read the detailed notes Ms. Thompson had scribbled throughout his essay. Each one seemed designed to tear down, not teach. Poor understanding. She'd written next to a paragraph he'd spent hours researching, clearly copying from somewhere, beside facts he'd found in the library's historical archives. A soft knock on his door made him jump. His sister stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Peace offering," she said, walking in without waiting for an answer. She'd always been good at knowing when something was really wrong. "I don't want to talk about it," Michael mumbled, trying to slide the paper under his textbook. But his sister was too quick. She set down the hot chocolates and gently pulled the essay from his grip. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to shock, then to anger. This isn't right," she said, her voice tight. "She can't do this. We need to show Mom and Dad." "No." Michael grabbed for the paper, but his sister held it out of reach. "They're both so busy, and Dad's got that big case." "That's exactly why they need to see this," she insisted. "This isn't about a bad grade, Michael. This is about something much worse." Just then, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Their mom appeared in the doorway, smiling at the sight of her children sharing hot chocolate. But her smile faded as she noticed the tension in the room. "What's going on?" Before Michael could stop her, his sister handed over the paper. He watched his mom's face as she read, seeing the same progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then something he rarely saw: anger. "I'm calling your father," she said quietly, still staring at the paper. "He needs to come home now." Word spread through school the next day, despite Michael's best efforts to keep things quiet. It started when his friend noticed the paper sticking out of his backpack during lunch. One look at the comment, and soon whispers were flying through the cafeteria. Other students began sharing their own stories, how Ms. Thompson had made similar comments to them, but never in writing. How she discouraged certain students from taking advanced classes, suggesting they might be more comfortable in easier ones. How she'd praise some students lavishly while ignoring others completely. By afternoon, the whispers had reached the teacher's lounge. Mr. Rogers, the science teacher, overheard students discussing it in his class and immediately went to the principal's office. Other teachers followed, sharing their own concerns about patterns they'd noticed but hadn't been able to prove. Michael spent that day feeling like he was underwater. Everything seemed distant and muffled. Some students avoided him, while others patted his back in solidarity. A few even showed him their own papers from Miss Thompson, revealing a clear pattern that nobody had dared to challenge before. Meanwhile, Miss Thompson carried on as if nothing had happened. She swept into class with her usual air of superiority, barely glancing at Michael's empty seat. He'd been allowed to study in a library instead. But there was something different in her demeanor, a slight edge of nervousness that hadn't been there before. What she didn't know was that Michael's parents hadn't slept the night before, making phone calls and drafting emails. They hadn't told him their plan yet, wanting to protect him from more stress. But as Michael sat in the library, trying to focus on his reading, events were already in motion that would expose years of hidden discrimination and change the school forever. The truth was about to come out, and Miss Thompson had no idea what was coming or who she had really messed with this time. The principal's office was unusually quiet that morning. Dr. Wilson sat at his desk, reviewing the stack of papers before him for the third time. 20 years as a school principal, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk as he prepared for what would surely be the most difficult meeting of his career. At precisely 8:30 a.m., Ms. Thompson clicked her way into the office, perfectly pressed as always in her designer suit. She carried herself with the same air of superiority she always had, despite being called in before classes started. The secretary's disapproving glance went unnoticed as she walked past. "You wanted to see me?" Ms. Thompson's voice carried its usual hint of condescension, even when addressing her superior. She settled into one of the chairs across from Dr. Wilson's desk, smoothing her skirt with manicured hands. Dr. Wilson took a deep breath, removing his reading glasses. "Yes, thank you for coming in early. We need to discuss some serious concerns that have been brought to my attention." He pulled out Michael's homework assignment, now protected in a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it on the desk between them. Ms. Thompson barely glanced at it. "Ah, yes. The boy clearly didn't put in the effort required for a better grade. I maintain my assessment was fair." "Fair?" Dr. Wilson's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm not just talking about the grade, Ms. Thompson. I'm talking about this comment you wrote." He turned the paper so she could clearly see her own handwriting. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. Sometimes students need to hear the truth about their capabilities. We can't coddle them forever. Dr. Wilson opened a folder on his desk. 5 other teachers have come forward with concerns about similar comments you've made in class. We have documented complaints spanning the last 3 years. He began laying out paper after paper. Emails from concerned teachers, notes from parents, student complaints that had previously been dismissed. Ms. Thompson's confidence began to crack slightly. "Those are just misunderstandings. You know how sensitive people are these days. Everything gets blown out of proportion." "Misunderstandings?" Dr. Wilson's voice was quiet but firm. "We have records of you discouraging certain students from taking advanced placement tests, despite their qualifying grades. There are multiple witnesses to inappropriate comments you've made during class discussions." The morning light had crept across the desk now, illuminating the growing pile of evidence. Ms. Thompson shifted in her seat, her usual poise slipping. "Those students weren't ready for advanced classes. I was doing them a favor." "That wasn't your decision to make," Dr. Wilson replied. "Every student deserves an equal opportunity to challenge themselves and succeed." He pulled out more documents, statistics showing clear patterns in her grading, testimonials from former students, reports from other teachers who had noticed troubling trends but had been afraid to speak up until now. "The math doesn't lie, Ms. Thompson. Your grading patterns show significant discrepancies that can't be explained by student performance alone." Ms. Thompson's face had gone pale, but she still tried to maintain her composure. "You can't prove any of this is intentional. These are just coincidences and misinterpreted situations." Just then, there was a knock at the door. The secretary poked her head in. "Dr. Wilson, the Board of Education representatives are here for the emergency meeting. They're waiting in the conference room." Ms. Thompson's facade finally cracked. "The Board of Education? I wasn't informed about any board meeting." "No, you weren't," Dr. Wilson agreed, gathering his papers. "But given the severity of these allegations and the evidence we've gathered, they felt it warranted immediate attention." As they walked toward the conference room, the hallways were still empty. Classes wouldn't start for another 20 minutes. Their footsteps echoed off the lockers, each step bringing them closer to what would be a turning point for the entire school. Ms. Thompson tried one last time to regain control. "This is ridiculous. One student complains about a grade, and suddenly I'm being treated like a criminal." Dr. Wilson stopped just outside the conference room door. "This isn't about one grade or one student, Ms. Thompson. This is about a pattern of behavior that has potentially harmed countless young people under your care. And frankly," he paused, looking her directly in the eye, "you have no idea what you've started or who you're about to face in this room." Through the conference room window, Ms. Thompson could see several serious-looking people in business suits seated around the table. But one face in particular made her blood run cold. Though she didn't recognize him yet, she would soon understand exactly how badly she had miscalculated. The evening before the board meeting, Michael finally showed his father the homework paper. They sat in his father's home office, a warm room lined with law books and framed certificates. The desk lamp cast a gentle glow as Mr. Robinson studied the paper, his expression growing darker with each word he read. Michael had never seen his father so still. As one of the state's most respected civil rights attorneys and a member of the Board of Education, Mr. Robinson was known for his calm demeanor and measured responses. But now his hands gripped the paper just a little too tightly, and his jaw clenched in a way that Michael had rarely seen. "How long?" his father asked quietly, still looking at the paper. "How long has this been going on?" Michael shifted in his chair. "The comments started small at first," he explained. "Just little things, like she wouldn't call on me in class, or she'd say my answers weren't clear enough." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But it got worse after I got the highest score on the midterm exam." Mr. Robinson nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. He thought about all the times Michael had seemed less enthusiastic about school lately, how he'd stopped talking about history class, previously his favorite subject. As both a father and an education advocate, he felt a deep ache in his chest. "You know this isn't about you, right?" he said, looking at his son. "This is about her prejudices, her failures, not yours." Michael nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. His father stood up and walked around the desk, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you for showing me this. It took courage." That night, while Michael slept, his father made phone calls. First to colleagues on the Board of Education, then to other parents he helped over the years. Stories began pouring in, similar experiences with Ms. Thompson that had gone unreported because parents feared retaliation or didn't think they'd be believed. Mr. Robinson worked through the night, building a case that went far beyond one homework assignment. His wife brought him coffee at midnight, then again at 2 a.m., watching as he methodically documented every incident, every pattern, every violation of educational standards and civil rights. By dawn, he had compiled a comprehensive file that showed years of systematic discrimination. The homework paper that had hurt his son so deeply wasn't just one teacher's cruel comment, it was the piece of evidence that would finally expose a long-standing problem. As he got dressed for the emergency board meeting, Mr. Robinson thought carefully about his approach. He chose his most formal suit, the one he wore for major court cases. His wife helped him straighten his tie, understanding the weight of what was about to happen. "Give them hell," she whispered, straightening his collar. "But do it your way, with dignity and facts." The drive to school was quiet. Michael had been allowed to stay home that day, but he'd hugged his father extra tight before he left. "Dad," he'd said quietly, "thanks for believing me." Those words echoed in Mr. Robinson's mind as he walked into the school building. The halls were empty now, with students in their first period classes. His footsteps echoed against the lockers as he made his way to the conference room, briefcase heavy with evidence in his hand. Outside the conference room, he could see Ms. Thompson through the window, sitting rigidly in her chair as Dr. Wilson spoke to her. She hadn't noticed him yet. In fact, she had no idea that the parent she was about to face was not only a civil rights attorney, but also held a position that could reshape educational policy across the entire state. Mr. Robinson took a deep breath, thinking of his son's face when he'd finally shown him that paper. He thought of all the other students who might have suffered silently, afraid to speak up. He thought of his own experiences as a student and how he'd promised himself he'd fight to make things better for the next generation. As he reached for the door handle, he wasn't just Michael's father anymore. He was every parent who'd ever had to comfort a child hurt by prejudice, every advocate who'd fought for equal education, every voice that had been silenced by fear or indifference. The door opened and heads turned to face him. Ms. Thompson's expression shifted from annoyed to confused as she took in his professional appearance and the Board of Education badge clipped to his lapel. In that moment, before he'd said a single word, she began to realize just how seriously she had miscalculated. The next few hours would change not just his son's school, but would set a precedent for how similar cases would be handled across the state. Mr. Robinson adjusted his tie one last time and stepped into the room, ready to ensure that what happened to his son would never happen to another child again. The conference room fell silent as Mr. Robinson entered. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the long table where board members sat with expressions of grave concern. Ms. Thompson's confident pose faltered as she watched him take his seat at the head of the table, directly across from her. "Good morning," Mr. Robinson said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority that had won him numerous civil rights cases. "I believe we're here to discuss a serious matter of educational discrimination." He opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness, laying out documents one by one. Ms. Thompson's eyes darted between the faces around the table, reality slowly dawning on her. "I'm sorry," she interrupted, her voice higher than usual. "But who exactly are you?" Mr. Robinson looked up from his papers, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'm Michael Robinson's father, a member of the State Board of Education and the civil rights attorney who will be presenting evidence of systematic discrimination in your classroom." The color drained from Ms. Thompson's face as she finally made the connection. Several board members shifted in their seats, already familiar with Mr. Robinson's reputation for handling discrimination cases. "Let's begin with Exhibit A," Mr. Robinson continued, sliding a copy of Michael's homework assignment across the table. "This is the paper that brought us here today, but it's far from the only evidence we'll be discussing." He proceeded to lay out the case methodically, like pieces of a puzzle fitting together. Copies of emails from concerned parents dating back 3 years. Statistical analysis of Ms. Thompson's grading patterns showing clear biases. Testimonies from former students who had been discouraged from taking advanced placement courses despite their qualifying grades. Mr. Rogers, the science teacher, reports that several students who struggled in your class are now excelling in his advanced science courses, Mr. Robinson noted, referencing another document. "Interesting how their abilities seemed to improve once they left your classroom." Ms. Thompson's usual composure cracked entirely. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You can't possibly suggest that giving honest feedback to students who aren't performing well is discrimination." "Honest feedback." Mr. Robinson's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath it. He pulled out more papers. "Is this what you call honest feedback?" He began reading from various student assignments, each bearing similar dismissive and discriminatory comments. The board members exchanged concerned glances as the evidence mounted. Dr. Wilson, the principal, sat with his hands clasped tightly, his earlier suspicions now confirmed beyond doubt. "But perhaps most concerning," Mr. Robinson continued, "is this pattern of discouraging certain students from academic advancement." He presented a chart showing how Ms. Thompson's recommendations for advanced placement classes correlated suspiciously with certain demographics. Ms. Thompson's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. "You're twisting everything," she protested weakly. "Taking things out of context." "Context?" Mr. Robinson raised an eyebrow. "Let's talk about context." He pulled out statements from other teachers, describing how students' confidence and performance improved dramatically after leaving Ms. Thompson's class. The context seems quite clear. One of the board members, Mrs. Chen, leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, how do you explain these patterns in your grading and recommendations?" Before Ms. Thompson could respond, Mr. Robinson produced one final piece of evidence. A recording from a parent-teacher conference where she had explicitly discouraged a student from pursuing advanced courses, suggesting they know their limitations. The room grew heavy with silence as the recording played. Ms. Thompson's own words, spoken with casual cruelty, filled the air. She sat rigid in her chair, watching her carefully constructed facade crumble around her. "I've been teaching for 20 years, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one has ever questioned my methods before." "That's exactly the problem," Mr. Robinson replied firmly. "No one questioned it because those affected felt powerless to speak up. But that changes today." He turned to address the entire room. "This isn't just about my son or any single student. This is about ensuring every child has an equal opportunity to learn and grow. When we allow prejudice to masquerade as professional judgment, we fail not just our students, but our entire educational system." The board members nodded gravely. They had seen enough. Dr. Wilson cleared his throat, ready to announce the next steps, but Ms. Thompson suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You have no idea how hard it is," she burst out, "teaching students who just aren't cut out for." "That's enough," Mr. Robinson cut her off, his voice sharp for the first time. "Every word you speak only further proves our case. The question now isn't whether discrimination occurred, but what we're going to do about it." He looked around the table at his fellow board members, seeing determination in their eyes. The time for change had come, and they all knew it. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the conference room table where years of hidden discrimination were finally being brought to light. The next few days at Riverside Middle School felt different. News traveled fast in the small community, and everyone could sense that something big was happening. Ms. Thompson's classroom stood empty, a substitute teacher quietly taking her place while the investigation continued. In the teacher's lounge, conversations shifted from daily gossip to serious discussions about responsibility and change. Mr. Rogers, the science teacher who had first reported his concerns, found himself surrounded by colleagues sharing similar stories they'd been too afraid to tell before. "I saw her turn away a brilliant student from advanced classes last year," one teacher admitted during lunch. "I should have said something then." Others nodded, the weight of silent complicity heavy in the room. Meanwhile, Mr. Robinson worked tirelessly, transforming one case into a catalyst for systemic change. His office became a hub of activity as more parents came forward, not just from Riverside Middle School, but from other schools in the district. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of long-standing discrimination that had gone unchecked for years. At home, Michael noticed his father working late into the night, phone calls and meetings stretching well past dinner time. One evening, he brought his dad a sandwich and found him surrounded by stacks of papers. "You don't have to do all this," Michael said quietly, placing the plate on his father's desk. "I mean, Ms. Thompson's already been suspended." His father looked up, removing his reading glasses. "This isn't just about Ms. Thompson anymore, son. Sometimes, when you pull one thread, you discover the whole fabric needs to be rewoven." The investigation revealed more than anyone had expected. Beyond Ms. Thompson's individual actions, there were systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. The lack of oversight in grading practices, the absence of clear channels for reporting discrimination, the culture of silence that discouraged students and teachers from speaking up, all of it needed to change. 1 week after the initial confrontation, the school board called another meeting. This time, the conference room was packed. Teachers, parents, and administrators filled every seat, with more people standing along the walls. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Dr. Wilson opened the meeting with an announcement that sent whispers through the crowd. Ms. Thompson's contract would be terminated, effective immediately. But that was just the beginning. Mr. Robinson stood up next, holding a thick document titled Educational Equity Action Plan. As he began to speak, the room fell silent. "What happened in Ms. Thompson's classroom wasn't an isolated incident," he began, his voice firm but compassionate. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that we have the opportunity and the obligation to address." He outlined a comprehensive plan for change: mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, regular reviews of grading patterns, clear procedures for reporting concerns, and the establishment of an educational equity committee comprising teachers, parents, and students. The most powerful moment came when several students who had been in Ms. Thompson's classes over the years stood up to share their stories. One quiet girl described how she'd given up on her dream of becoming a scientist after being told she wasn't suited for advanced courses. Now, with support from teachers like Mr. Rogers, she was back on track, excelling in advanced placement classes. As the meeting progressed, something remarkable happened. What had started as a response to one teacher's discriminatory actions transformed into a community-wide commitment to change. Teachers volunteered to serve on the equity committee. Parents offered to help review and revise school policies. Even students asked how they could contribute to making their school more inclusive. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the changes at Riverside Middle School. Other schools in the district began reaching out, asking to implement similar reforms. What had started with one cruel comment on a homework assignment was snowballing into a movement for educational equity. Late that evening, after the meeting ended, Mr. Robinson found Michael waiting for him outside the conference room. Without saying a word, his son hugged him tightly. "You know what the best part is? Michael said as they walked to the car. "It's not just about getting rid of one bad teacher. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anybody else." His father smiled, feeling a profound mix of pride and hope. The past few weeks had been challenging, but they had proven that one voice speaking up could inspire others to find their courage. The changes they'd set in motion would ripple out far beyond Riverside Middle School, touching countless lives in ways they might never know. As they drove home under the setting sun, both father and son understood that while justice had been served in one sense, their work was really just beginning. But now, they had an entire community ready to help build a better, fairer future for all students. 1 year later, Riverside Middle School had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The hallways buzzed with a new energy as students hurried to their classes, no longer afraid to raise their hands or share their thoughts. The changes that had begun with one homework assignment had grown into something remarkable. In the newly established Student Success Center, a wall displayed photographs from the school's first Educational Equity Conference. Students, teachers, and parents had come together to share stories and strategies for creating a more inclusive learning environment. Michael's photo was there, standing proudly next to his father as they delivered the keynote speech. The morning announcements now regularly featured student achievements from all backgrounds. Today's highlight was about a girl who had been in Miss Thompson's class last year, struggling to maintain a C average. Now, under the guidance of her new history teacher, she had just won the state history competition with a project about civil rights in education. "Remember when we were afraid to even answer questions?" one student asked another as they passed Michael in the hallway. They were headed to an advanced placement study group, something that had become increasingly popular since the school removed barriers to enrollment in challenging courses. In the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Monthly training sessions had replaced casual gossip, with teachers actively sharing strategies for recognizing and addressing their own unconscious biases. Mr. Rogers, now heading the Educational Equity Committee, was discussing the latest feedback from student surveys. "The numbers speak for themselves," he said, pointing to a chart. "Participation rates are up across the board. Students who were previously disengaged are now some of our most active learners." The changes hadn't stopped at Riverside's doors. Mr. Robinson's case had sparked a district-wide review of educational practices. 5 other schools had already adopted similar reforms, and more were following suit. The State Board of Education was using Riverside's new policies as a model for addressing discrimination in schools across the state. Michael's father had become a sought-after speaker at educational conferences, sharing the story of how one incident had launched a movement for change. But he always made sure to credit the real heroes, the students who had found the courage to speak up and the teachers who had supported them. During lunch period, Michael sat with a diverse group of friends in the courtyard. The old social barriers that had once divided the school seemed to be fading. Students who might never have talked to each other before were now studying together, sharing jokes and supporting each other's dreams. "Hey, did you see this?" His friend showed him a local newspaper article. The headline read, "Riverside Middle School Sets New Standard for Educational Equity." Michael smiled, remembering how different things had been just a year ago. In his new history class, discussions were lively and inclusive. The teacher, Mrs. Baker, had a way of making every student feel valued. Today, they were studying past civil rights movements, and Michael found himself raising his hand more often, connecting historical events to his own experience. "Change doesn't always come from big movements," Mrs. Baker explained to the class. "Sometimes it starts with one person standing up and saying this isn't right." After school, Michael stopped by his father's office. The walls were now covered with letters from parents and students from across the state, sharing their own stories and thanking him for making a difference. But the most prominent display was Michael's original homework assignment, the one that had started it all, framed as a reminder that every voice matters. "You know what's really amazing?" Michael said to his father as they walked to the car. "It's not just about grades anymore. It's about everyone having a fair chance to learn and grow." His father nodded, watching students stream out of the building, laughing and talking together. And that's the most important lesson of all. The sun was setting over Riverside Middle School, casting a warm glow on the building's brick walls. The old sign out front now had a new addition underneath, where every student matters, every voice counts. Inside, the last few teachers were gathering their things, preparing for tomorrow. On classroom walls, student projects displayed a range of perspectives and experiences. The school library had expanded its collection to include authors from diverse backgrounds, and the trophy case now showcased achievements in everything from science to art to community service. As Michael finished his homework that evening, he looked at his latest history assignment. The A+ at the top was nice, but it was the teacher's comment that meant the most. Excellent analysis. Your voice adds valuable perspective to our class discussions. He smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. What had started as one person's stand against injustice had grown into a movement that changed not just a school, but an entire community's approach to education. And somewhere out there, other students were finding their voices too, ready to stand up for what was right. The story of Riverside Middle School had become more than just a lesson about confronting discrimination. It was a reminder that positive change is possible when people come together with courage, determination, and hope for a better future.